think it's very difficult for white folks to talk to each other about racism and white privilege because we have been conditioned not to talk about it.
We live in a world where we consider ourselves the center and the norm, and everything else is the other.
From what I understand, whiteness really was created to consolidate power. And the concept then was supported by creating other identities like blackness.
It's not easy for white folks to be told about whiteness and to be told how that whiteness has resulted in the oppression of non-white people.
People act as though whiteness is a monolith, and it's deeply not, and it can be really hard to kind of get past all of that nuance that is your lived experience to recognize that there's like really patterns that even if you are very poor and disabled and queer and a religious minority, it's just hard to get there from that initial feeling of like being held responsible for a thing that you didn't do.
I feel a burden that I'm becoming more comfortable with. And the burden is coming up with a better understanding of what a positive white identity is.
As an individual, it's just so important to reflect on whiteness, white supremacy, and think about ways in our daily lives that we can go about and withhold consent and cooperation from systems of white supremacy and racism.
And I think that it's time to start really building these skills so that I can have these conversations with people, not only strangers, but also friends, family, and loved ones in my own life.
I assumed it was standard operating procedure.
Okay, doing like on stage like someone
So there's a staircase right here.
We welcome folks first and foremost. We thank them for coming out and doing something weird, talking to white people on their doorsteps about race. We talk about SURJ and our values. We go through our agenda, we get to know each other, we talk a little bit about what we've learned in this project over the past few years, about what works in having these kind of conversations with folks.
Oh, thank you for reminding me, because we're getting ready for the group we call 1.0. And that is the people who are coming to the Deep Canvas for the first time, which I just love. That group of people who's taking that really large step, and it's really exciting.
Building relationships with people to be able to talk about this unresolved trauma in our nation is crucial. So I'm really psyched.
So I'm Sarah, and this is Jessie. We're the trainers, and if you feel comfortable introducing your name and if you have a preferred gender.
And then we'll go around so that everyone knows who's in the room.
I'm Sora. I use he, him pronouns.
We do so much in 1.0. We do a little bit of teaching, a little bit of conversation.
Christine, she, her. Hannah, she, her. Kate, she, her.
And then we give people a script, a little bit of an idea of how these conversations can go, what questions we can ask to elicit, meaningful responses from folks. And then we practice. We practice storytelling, we practice asking questions, and then we go out on the doors.
I must admit, I've lived in a lot of white, progressive, liberal bubbles. People saying things that I either at the time or I realized right after that is racist, I label as racist,
anti-people of color, and I've felt paralyzed, whether it's something I observed in happening in a public space or heard a friend or family say. I'd been taught a lot of self-defense, but I hadn't learned anything about intervening.
Yeah.
Personal story. My wife's uncle is very outspoken about thinking that Black people are taking advantage of the system by making themselves victims, and I just thought he was a rich white ass, and was just really judgmental toward him. And it took a while to walk myself through that and realize that I wasn't doing anything productive by holding that position.
Right? Like there's this exclusion that happens there in a subtle way. Yeah.
Talk about the things that maybe you have experienced entering into some of these spaces.
Everyone is expected to be on the same page about such a wide variety of topics that even if you agree on 5 of those topics, if there's 3 that you don't, then there's this shutting down, there's the wall goes up, and there's judgment and morals.
Diversity of opinions, right? Or difference or process, right? Like being in the process of trying to figure out how do I feel about that thing. Yeah.
Usually comes up because make a very broad sweeping claim about structural inequality, and that leads them to be like, hey, wait, I don't agree or I don't believe in what you just said. And that is sort of always an unfortunate starting point, because I've just said this thing like really blasé. They're like, of course I believe this. And they're like defensive right away, like, I don't think that's true. Like, how do you get it back? Because what happens is I get defensive.
Right.
And it doesn't go anywhere, and it's not helpful. And this is like conversations with employers and with my family, and just sort of like all across the board, I have this problem.
Do you have a personal experience?
Oh, I mean, I've been the person who was too urgent to get things done, and I've left people behind.
We're like, okay, we're going to get half the room to have this conversation, and half this room is going to hate us for it. But that's okay right now. But we didn't always like slow it down to make sure those half could then be part of that conversation.
Is a sense, I think, of urgency, like people's lives, are on the line in the absence, and yet, there is something about doing this kind of work, right? We're slowing down, right? We're taking a whole day to like talk to each other and think about and practice.
Taking the time to think about personal experiences, a particular story to share with people at their doors. I've had trauma in my family history as a Jewish person, but I've never dealt with systemic racism. I still have privilege. I still live in a system where I'm recognized as white first. Actually, a really good friend of mine who's an African-American woman, we worked together, and there was a time that she told me she felt I was patronizing her, and that was really hard to hear. There's just so much violence and hurt in racism and in whiteness. And because at that time in my life I hadn't thought through what are all these feelings about and where do they come from, it just felt like this big, overwhelming, chaotic kind of emotional response. But understanding it more in terms of how I want to think of myself and how I value myself made it much more manageable. So thinking about what stories do I want to share really helped ground me and give me more confidence and centeredness about speaking to people in person at their doors.
I find that on the doors that even maybe if someone had never said anything before, some people are primed to have this conversation because they've never had that.
I do get defensive. I think for me, some of it has to do with feeling I'm not fully seen. Like wanting to talk about, well, I have a disability, I'm autistic, or I'm trans, or especially I think the number one thing for me is actually being from the South and growing up in poverty. When you're poor, there's a lot of forces working to keep you poor. Shame is still like a really powerful response to me, and I really have to navigate that shame before I can have productive conversations around whiteness.
How did you connect with that person? Did you lock eyes with them in the metro? Did you
I think a big part of the way white supremacy operates is just by shutting down conversations and shutting down connection and shutting down vulnerability. So just having a conversation with someone is working against all those mechanisms.
Just move to the examples of the open-ended questions.
So I can say this was inspired by a training that the leadership blog showed us.
Exactly. Yeah, and then there we've got the foundation. So when we move on to the agitation, they have the examples they can use. And then I think it's mostly just breakouts. You know, we'll do 20 minutes practicing the cone of curiosity. 2.0 is the training for people who have canvassed before, who want to come and really deepen their skill set a little bit. So we do skills-based trainings, we do political education to get more into the theory of it all and really prepare folks to go out on the doors.
So this training today is about the cone of curiosity and agitation, which is a lot about how to ask more open-ended, deeper questions to folks on the doors so that we can really get them to open up and get to a place where they're being more emotional and vulnerable with us. So we use this cone of curiosity that starts with asking the person on the door for a specific story, asking them to describe it, getting into their feelings about what happened, and then digging deep into where those feelings came from.
Asking folks to do some introspection onto, okay, like, yes, I had the feeling, especially if they're talking about like, oh, I felt angry, defensive, or I felt guilty, you know. Talk about what was it that caused that feeling? What are your beliefs? What are your values? You know, what are the things you think about yourself as a person, or you think about our community or our country that were called into question that prompted those feelings? Find a partner. We're going to take 20 minutes, so 10 minutes for each person. And go through this with each other. So I'm going to set a timer for 10 minutes, and so after that one goes off, I'll let you all know to switch sides.
Why would you have to be okay, yeah, so they don't actually say this, it's like, how do we dress black?
Yeah, I agree, like, hearing that you really are recognizing systems of oppression or not, and like...
Now we're in a breakout session where the canvassers have each picked a partner and they're practicing the cone of curiosity. So I gave them the prompt of talking about a time in the recent past when they've been made aware of their own whiteness or racial justice issues in their lives. And they're practicing asking each other probing questions to really prompt them to expand on the stories and talk about how they felt and how it impacted them.
You know, a lot of people would used to like dress up in like blackface, and a lot of the things that like things that I might have listened to like as a kid, I didn't even know that had like so many racist ties.
Oh, well, don't worry, we'll get back to that.
It's a learning process of figuring out how to talk to someone about that story, how to talk to a stranger about that story.
When I was trying to think of a story to talk about in this exercise, it was kind of difficult to think of something that I had directly experienced, but there was something that I had been kind of wrestling with recently anyway, and Erin, my conversation partner, said, yeah, bring that on. Let's talk about that too. It was great.
It was really great to hear your story, and yeah, I think it absolutely was applicable to this exercise because whiteness is a racial identity, and so our experiences of whiteness are stories about race too.
I don't feel that great about whiteness as a racial identity. I feel pretty good about myself as an individual, but whiteness as a racial identity is quite a challenge to own. It's built on, in a lot of ways, the subjugation and the appropriation of other cultures, which is to say, the pushing down and the theft of other cultures. And there's a lot to be examined there, and there's a lot of sense of emptiness for me.
A lot of us in this work have had to move through stages of grief or guilt or shame around our own whiteness, but that's really important work to do. Oftentimes, we find commonalities in our stories or in our experiences, and that, I think, makes us feel a little bit less isolated as white folks.
All right, sound good?
I feel super complicated about whiteness as a racial identity. I live a pretty marginal life in a lot of ways, and I really leveraged my white privilege to just be okay, to be housed, to have the possibility of a sustainable job in the future.
Does that impact our lives?
So when people talk about giving up your privilege, to me that sounds like you should be on the street. That's a lot of times what I hear from that. And I think that maybe for some other people, it's not so extreme.
But like, let's talk about the fact that like things that happen to our families like happen to us too. And how
The story that I've told most on Doors, it's actually a very hard, very personal story. So when I was a kid, I was harmed by another older child in a really serious way. A few years back, I decided I wanted to forgive her. And I really did a lot of thinking and reading about what it would take for me to do that. And I found this idea of asking for restitution, and like restitution is not justice. Like you can't repair, you can't fix the thing that was broken. But when you ask for restitution, what you're saying is, I'm giving up my right to resentment and my right to like hold against you that you've harmed me in this way, and I'm going to accept what is actually possible for you to give. And for me, just the act of asking for restitution was really healing and really made it possible for me to forgive her in ways that I couldn't have.
Feel that way to you? Like, how does it impact you to know about this?
The fact that she's not giving me restitution doesn't change the fact that I need to do that for myself, but it does change the kind of relationship I could have with her.
Gathering of 14 women.
I think the person listening on Doors often wishes that I could have a different ending. I wish I could have a different ending. But then we have this parallel to racial injustice in America today, and it's like, we can give that a different ending. There is time for that. It can happen.
Like, no matter what they're talking about something because it's impacted them in some way. So just making sure you take it to that.
I think finding our own personal stories to share is the core of deep canvassing. When you get really into people's own lived experiences and are able to pull those apart and really dig in, particularly to people's emotions about that, and have them introspect on emotions, I think that's where space opens up and people are able to consider things in new ways and have that shift. So I think that's part of why it's so important, is that if we're asking other people to do that, we need to be able to do it ourselves and put as much of ourselves into the conversations as we expect or hope that people on the Doors put in.
Ready for the potluck lunch that happens sort of in the middle of the Canvas day. I'm talking with Lindsay here, who is one of the people who have volunteered to bring food for the Deep Canvas. At every Deep Canvas, we have a potluck lunch, and as the potluck name implies, that food comes from everybody who's come to Canvas with us. So I'm just making sure that we have the right amount of food, a right type of food, and then we have the ingredients listed.
I brought a butternut squash salad with corn, craisins, and cilantro.
So we've got, from our friend Erin, some gluten-free cheese.
So many things in the world right now are so focused on going fast. And Deep Canvas is a tactic that just can't be fast.
Day, who is not Canvas.
You have to really take time to listen to people, and you really have to take time to build relationships with the other people who you're building the canvassing program with.
Inspired kidney bean dish, which is...
There are a lot of ways to be marginalized as a white person, and if you are marginalized in one or several of those ways, it's really important, and we need to grapple with that as a movement if we're going to make space for people. And I think the nature of the canvas itself makes it a better place for that effort, because people are just constantly practicing, listening to other people, and thinking about, like, what does it take for growth to really happen. trying to get 3.5% of the population in the streets. And that is just a different kind of animal.
When the Canvas put out a call for people to get more involved, there were a bunch of different teams that were meeting at the time, and one of them was the data and turf team. Data collection and analysis is also what I do in my day job, so that was the piece that was most interesting to me.
So right after lunch, we hand canvassers their materials for going out on the doors. That includes their turf, their script, and the sliding scale that they use in the script. Our scripts walks canvassers through a sort of conversation guide so that they can have an open, vulnerable conversation with folks on the doors. And at a few different points in the conversation, 2 different points at the beginning and end, they use a sliding scale to help people gauge where they feel on an issue. Our script focuses on reparations, which we define as making amends, ideally material amends, for past and current harms. And in our script, we're talking particularly about the harms that Black folks in this country have experienced, whether that's through slavery or through Jim Crow and segregation, through violent, racist fear-mongering like lynching and like some of the murders that we're seeing today from police. All those sorts of things fall under, I think, what we would argue people deserve reparations for.
Yeah, so we should probably just go down, cross over, come back up, and then if we have more time, we'll try to hit these houses also.
Sounds good. I thought was on Wooden Bridge Road. We are starting to go door to door and have conversations with white folks about racism. So looking forward to, interesting conversations.
Yeah, we're figuring out which houses are on our turf.
So this is the turf data because our data team collects the information of how many people we've talked to, if it was emotional, if people listened, if the conversation was derailed. And then we also just have a map and our script below here. So this is a complete clipboard.
The first part of our script is really just us introducing ourselves to folks and talking a little bit about why we're there. We ask them if they think any historic or current harm has been done to the Black community in America.
I feel like I'm someone that really has to talk through something before I know even like how I feel about it and what my opinion is, and a lot of these top subjects are so taboo that way people like are just like, well, this is what I feel about it because I've never actually discussed it. So now we're like making a space to be like, well, let's like talk about it and see how we actually feel.
We follow up with if folks have heard of reparations before, we offer them a really quick definition of it, and then we ask them on this 0 to 10 scale, where 0 is completely against paying reparations to Black people and 10 is completely in favor of paying reparations to Black people, where they would put themselves. We know through research that having to reflect and actually put a number down is a different level of reflection and requires some deeper work from folks. Also ask them to think about it in their own life and ask about if they've noticed any racism or harm against Black people in their communities, trying to also really ground it in the lived experiences all of us have.
There's usually a moment where someone exhales, lets their body sort of settle into that doorway, and that's when I know we are connecting. We're interested in hearing, listening, and talking to each other.
A lot of the folks we talk to aren't really aware of things like generational wealth, inherited wealth, things like redlining, or really even white privilege and white supremacy as a system.
So after we spent that time building some rapport with canvassers and uncovering some of how they think about this,
We move into what we call the storytelling part of the script, and our script focuses on a story about harm and accountability, and this section is really where we get pretty deep with folks.
Storytelling is so key. It's the hook. It's the thing that gets people to go from, I'm about to shut the door on you, you're a stranger, and why are you talking about racism right now? To, okay, you're being a little bit vulnerable, you're sharing a little bit about yourself, I'm connecting with you, I'm seeing you as another human, as another person, as my neighbor.
And they let you into this space of who they are and what's important to them.
Storytelling is how we understand ourselves and understand the world. And it's something that is universal. And so that is really the key ingredient to deep canvassing and for getting people to potentially open their hearts.
None of us who are white can understand the deep violence and generations of harm that is racism and anti-Blackness in this country. But every single person in the world knows what it's like to be hurt and to experience harm and to not always get accountability around that or get repair around that.
You hear so many different stories on the doors of people reflecting on their immigrant experience or seeing and witnessing racism in their communities and in their workplaces, and they start talking about it. And then you can start to connect those stories to bigger structural issues and to policies. And then you start talking about things like reparations and linking it to, you know, people's lived experiences and the things that they value. And it's really, really powerful.
No, emotionally, yes. Did you see tears in her eyes?
She was like welling up, yeah, I'd say so.
Listen, yes. So definitely 15.
Yeah, definitely more than 15.
Sort of, this is what happened to me when, and this is what it felt like to not get my needs met, to not feel cared for, to, you know, feel brushed aside, whatever it is. And to really connect that back to how do we take care of each other after we've been hurt.
That covered a lot of ground and a lot of personal stories.
An incredible amount of personal stories.
Yeah. And
Wild.
just the idea of, you know, everybody wants to not be a racist, but then sometimes you realize that it runs deep and you observe it in fellow white folks, and it's kind of a startling realization. And so she was telling a lot of personal stories about that and friends. So really, all in all, very interesting conversation.
Yeah.
It's not just about offering material reparations, although that's crucial. It's looking at how the system we live in continues to cause harm. And I can see more clearly that it benefits the people who are harmed by white supremacy in the present, and it benefits me too. I want to live in a world that's more equitable.
The way that we wrap up is we show them the scale again, and folks have an opportunity to either put themselves, you know, where they were, further back, which is not ideal, or further towards supporting reparations. And when they do that and they say that second number, we ask them what's behind that shift for you. And then having them do a little bit of reflection on what made that shift possible if there's been a shift. And then after that, we thank them for being vulnerable with us, having a pretty hard and deep and often pretty scary conversation about race with a stranger.
Everyone just got back from the canvas. We were just starting our debrief. We devote a chunk of time at the end to talking about how it went. Some of the conversations can be emotional, some of them are really happy, some of them are challenging, so we have that time to check in on each other. But we also spend a lot of time talking about what we found effective in the conversations, what worked, what got people to really think about race on the doors, so that we're learning together as a group how to best have these conversations when we go out.
He was like an academic and liked reading and clearly had read a lot of stuff.
It sounds like you really care about resources distributed equitably. And as a white person who, you know, was not harmed by racism, you know, whose job is it to decide how to distribute, you know, reparations? I was like, is it my job or is it the people who were harmed? And he just kind of sat with that for a second and was like, yeah.
We ran into a Jewish couple and how that informed their understanding of race and prejudice and injustice. And we ran into, you know, like this guy was from Iran. It's not as... So at the end of the day, I'm feeling exuberated, but I'm also feeling exhausted and drained emotionally from all the different kinds of conversations I've had. Right. Debriefing has really helped me make connections that I wouldn't normally have if I didn't speak with other people. It kind of helps me organize my feelings, organize my thoughts, and share them in a way that I can understand them and make sense of them myself.
This is an ongoing process for all of us. We're not going to have fully developed anti-racist thoughts from day one. That as white folks, we are constantly unlearning the things that we have been conditioned to believe.
I feel like we talked to like a lot of like more middle-aged white guys in a row who like really shut down.
Yeah, it was actually kind of alarming, to be honest, of like how deep the like white supremacist like religious kind of framework was, of just like almost hitting like everything of like, you know, like intermarriage, racial intermarriage, and racial adoption, and the roots of different groups of people, and like God doesn't want people to mix, you know. And so it was hard to like know what to do in that situation.
I think that the training and the practice of deep canvas helps get through that paralysis feeling, because if you care about this and you've been caring about this and doing this for a while, you've probably had a lot of these conversations that did not go so well.
That discomfort is totally cool, and that's actually an important part of the conversations.
When I encounter really deep white supremacy on the doors, it can be really scary, for lack of a better word. Sometimes folks have said things that have really taken me aback, and it's been kind of a rude awakening or a reminder that this kind of thinking is still rampant in our culture, in our society. So mostly at first it's intimidating, and then it's a decision-making process of, well, how do I engage? What do I say? How much do I engage? Do I engage?
And then we got to this guy, and I asked him if he had an instance of harm that he could think of, and he told us sort of like the outline of a story, and then set a boundary of like, I'm like not willing to say more about this, like that's what I can give you. And I feel like it was the first time when I really got to practice probing for more emotion in that story without asking for more details, and sort of explicitly said to him, like, I don't want to ask you to share more than you're willing, like, you're already being really vulnerable, but I'm curious, what did you feel when you were going through X? And then later was like, what would it, like, it sounds like this happened, or I think I asked, like, did this happen or did this happen? Like, did you get justice for it or not? And he said no, and asked him what it would have felt like could he imagine what it would have been like for him if he did get that. And he, like, told me feelings about what that might have felt like, and, like...
This practice really offers a lot of tools to have conversations about racial injustice that don't have to escalate in 2 seconds, where people can feel safe and heard, and you can just sort of engage at the level that people are ready for.
Yeah, it was just really cool. I'd never gotten to, like, practice that, like, I can ask this person to be more vulnerable with me, even though they've set a boundary, and there's, like, a respectful way to navigate that.
If there's a beat in the conversation, which sometimes it's hard to find a beat in the conversation with that, I usually try to say, you know, I appreciate you sharing that. I don't really agree with what you're saying, which is okay. And I was wondering if you could tell me more about this or that, whatever. Try to redirect.
It's important, I think, to be witnessed and heard so that we don't end up carrying in us whatever we left the doors carrying, that we get the chance to kind of get it out of our bodies and out of our minds before we sort of re-emerge into the rest of our lives.
How this happened and how much of
I joked with them, they just did a weird thing. I think they're feeling nervous, but also kind of, wow, we did it. We all came back. We got a chance to practice talking about this, and it's kind of fulfilling. Really good feeling.
People who might be open to hear this.
In terms of what I learned from the Deep Canvas experience about connecting with myself and others through personal stories, it's to break down the hierarchy of whiteness by not talking down to people, not judging people, not trying to convince people that, well, I'm thinking the right way and you think wrong, so I've got to convince you to think like me.
We share a story. Learn from you in doing that, because I actually think you're right.
You got to.
It's more centered around the other person's feelings than about facts or like intellectual argumentative takedowns.
Not letting like the impulse to show people like compassion or give people space, like
this is my first time talking to this person about this thing. So even if they're saying stuff I've heard from many other people before, really treating them like you are an individual, not just the manifestation of this thing we call white supremacy.
Sounds like y'all had some hard conversations, maybe some conversations that maybe you felt like, I wasn't prepared to answer that question, or I didn't know how to respond, or I felt this really hard feeling. And yet that is part of the process, right? Is like doing that and then coming back and saying, okay, what could I do differently? What support do I need to keep doing this work? And you know, the idea is that 2.0 is a different training. You spend a little bit more time on the doors when you come back a second time, which is great because really practice doesn't make perfect, but practice is part of the process. And talk about different strategies, different types of stories that we can share that maybe feel a little bit more authentic to you. So just some things to leave you with. I'm feeling proud. Like I'm feeling really proud that you all like did this, and yeah, I think it is really a really brave thing.
Satisfied and ready for more.
Glad I came.
encouraged.
I'm feeling both satisfied and also a little disappointed.
I feel like tired, but also like reflective and good.
Yeah, all the feelings are normal and expected. And any single person in that room, or Sarah or I, like we've all felt each and every one of those feelings. 24 conversations. So all of those people whose doors you knocked on and had conversations with are gonna go to dinner tonight, are gonna meet up with someone tomorrow, are gonna get asked on Monday by their coworker what they did this weekend, and they're gonna say, this conversation with this person who knocked on my, right? Like they're gonna have to reckon with, what do I share about this? Or they Googled the Movement for Black Lives platform.
Part of the purpose of this project is our own political education and transformation as white people committed to racial justice in the world.
We honor, respect, and follow the years and centuries of resistance and struggle.
Led by people of color, Indigenous folks, and their communities.
Led by people of color, Indigenous folks, and their communities.
The practice of regularly every month spending 8 hours thinking deeply about our own experiences of race and racism, and I think particularly wrestling with what it means to have a white identity in the world and have more awareness of our whiteness in that way, is a huge shift for a lot of people that I think is like crucial to how we're able to live with each other and to our political development.
Woo! Go team!
Deep canvas is incredibly powerful, not just for the people doing it, but potentially for people who are receiving your knocks at the door. Them just knowing that there are people, white people, who maybe they see some of themselves in, at the door, in their free time, talking about racism, out there talking about reparations. Not because they want their money, not because they want a particular vote for any candidate, but because they want their neighbors and their members of the community to think critically about a really, really deep scar in our nation.
We have to learn how to talk about race and how to talk about healing and repair and sit with the magnitude of that in order for those things to ever become possible. Really see this as like a step in a longer journey.
The road to anti-racism is not linear.
How does it impact
and it's long, and there are peaks and valleys. You're never going to get it right all at once. You're going to make mistakes, and the important thing is just to keep learning and keep growing and keep having conversations.
I want folks who create and uphold harm in the world to be in the new world that me and the people I love are trying to build. I don't want a world without them, and it takes work to get there.
Dismantling white supremacy involves connection and reaching out to each other and being vulnerable with each other, and that we're not going to build a better world unless we have a greater sense of communities.
I love offering people this opportunity to see it can be like gentle and healing and respectful and about things that they in fact believe in as well.
I feel like I have a little bit more courage to step into the unknown, to step into discomfort, and I almost thrive now off of challenging myself and challenging others in a way that is centering love in the equation, and with the goal of course, creating a more just and equitable society.
I'd say you reach a point in this work, and I know I have, where you can't stop doing it because you really sense how important it is to continue to push for this kind of political and cultural and community change, and you see the possibility of the kind of world we can build together.